Welcome to our deep dive. And this time, we're heading into the world of Qílóu architecture. You know, those buildings with the covered walkways.
Yeah, those are fascinating.
They really are. So for everyone listening, I hope you're as excited as I am to uncover their origins and maybe even some surprising global connections, you know. I think you'll find it pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. And you know what's really interesting is that while the term Qílóu itself, well, it's relatively recent, emerging in Guangzhou in the early 20th century, the architectural style, it actually has much deeper roots.
Okay, so the name is new, but the style is old. That makes sense.
Precisely. You could say it's a bit like discovering a whole hidden history behind something you thought you knew.
Right, yeah. Like you think you know what a Qílóu is. But there's this whole story, this whole backstory we're about to dive into. And speaking of diving in, our sources for this deep dive lay out 5 origin theories for Qílóu, making it feel like we're piecing together a global puzzle. 5. What's the first piece we should look at?
Well, one theory, it takes us all the way to India with what's called the veranda style.
Veranda style. Okay, I'm intrigued.
You know those wide shaded verandas that you often see on traditional Indian bungalows?
Yeah. I could picture those.
Well, the British colonists, they adapted this style from India because it was just so incredibly effective in dealing with, the heat and humidity.
Smart. A practical solution. I mean, especially when you think about how widespread that kind of climate is, you know?
Exactly. And speaking of practical solutions, another theory that we have is the European arcade style.
Oh, yeah, arcades.
I remember those covered walkways that are so common in European market buildings?
Yeah, those are great. Shelter from the rain, the sun, keep shopping. Brilliant.
Precisely. And if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, all these regions we're talking about, India, the Mediterranean, Europe, and of course China, they were all connected by the Sea Silk Road.
Oh, the Sea Silk Road, right.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about how this ancient trade route shaped not just the flow of goods, but also the very evolution of architectural styles like Qílóu.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we've got Indian verandas, European arcades, all potentially influencing Qílóu. But the sources also mentioned a couple more uniquely Chinese influences, right?
Right.
There's the colonnade style, which is often found in Mediterranean churches, and then the Ganlin style of elevated housing in those flood-prone areas of southern China. What do you make of those?
Well, the Ganlin style is particularly intriguing because it suggests a possible evolutionary link,
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
So picture those ancient houses built on stilts. They could have gradually transformed into the covered walkways that we now associate with Qílóu.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
It's really a reminder that architecture, it's constantly adapting, right? Meeting the needs and the challenges of its environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I'm wondering if there are any surviving examples of that Ganlan style still around. I mean, it'd be amazing to, see that visual connection to early Qílóu,
It would be fascinating, wouldn't it?
It would. But for now, let's shift our focus to a region that's really known for its abundance of Qílóu buildings.
Yeah.
The 5 counties, Wuyi region of Guangdong. What makes this area a Qílóu hotspot?
Well, the 5 counties, and Taishan in particular, are incredibly rich in Qílóu architecture. And there's a clear historical timeline that explains why. It all begins in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when overseas Chinese started returning home.
So this is where those global connections we talked about really start to make an impact.
Exactly. They likely brought architectural ideas from their travels,
So then there's that boom in Qílóu construction in the 1920s. The source mentions specific regulations being put in place during this time to kind of govern their design. I'm guessing that's when we really start to see Qílóu becoming a defining feature of the urban landscape.
Absolutely. But like many architectural trends, Qílóu faced periods of, decline, war and economic hardship in the mid-20th century that really stalled development.
Right, of course. Makes sense.
And what's more, Qílóu buildings were sometimes even seen as symbols of Western influence during this time, and they fell into disrepair.
Oh, it's sad to hear,
Mm-hmm.
especially after their initial rise in popularity. But the source mentions a revival of appreciation for Qílóu starting in the 1980s. Tell me more about that.
Well, since the 1980s, there's been a renewed interest in preserving these architectural gems. And it's important to remember that the five counties, especially Taishan, were home to a large number of overseas Chinese. They played a critical role in introducing financing and really shaping the Qílóu style we see today.
So those global connections really came full circle. So we've got this concentration of Qílóu buildings in the five counties, largely thanks to the influence of overseas Chinese. Now let's dive into the different styles we find there. Were there any that particularly caught your eye in the research?
The most prevalent type in the five counties are those single or double unit Qílóus.
Okay, single or double?
Yeah, these likely reflect the need for practicality and, the limited availability of land in these bustling towns. However, you also have the multi-unit Qílóus, especially those ones that are prominent on corners. These structures really projected a sense of wealth and status.
So it's like the bigger your Qílóu, the more you're saying, hey, look at me.
It's almost like a subtle architectural language.
I see what you mean. The size and grandeur of your Qílóu becomes like a statement about your standing in the community.
Yeah.
Well, what about the stylistic variations within Qílóu architecture? I'm curious about how those global connections influenced the actual design element,
You'll find a fascinating mix of Western architectural styles woven into the fabric of Qílóu. Adding to the visual diversity of the streetscape, we're talking Romanesque, Gothic, Baroque, and Renaissance influences, each one kind of telling a story, about the aspirations and tastes of the people who commission these buildings.
And don't forget about the Southeast Asian touches.
Oh, right.
The source mentions some Qílóus having these round openings in their upper walls, possibly for wind resistance or even, symbolic reasons. It's incredible to see how all these different styles have kind of blended together in the five counties.
It really is a unique blend.
Yeah. But I'm curious about something. Are there any specific architectural features that, signify wealth and status? You mentioned that multi-unit Qílóus were a sign of affluence, but what else should we look for?
That's a great question. It gets to the heart of how architecture reflects social hierarchies. Aside from the size of the building, you'll notice variations in the materials used, the level of ornamentation, even the presence of certain, architectural elements borrowed from those Western styles. For example, a Qílóu with, say, elaborate Baroque details, or one that incorporates a grand Romanesque archway. That would definitely signal a higher level of status than, a simpler, more utilitarian structure.
So imagine walking down a street lined with Qílóus, and each one is subtly conveying the social standing of its owner.
Exactly.
It's like a visual map of the community's hierarchy.
And that map would be even more complex when you factor in the different professions and businesses housed within those Qílóus. Remember, these weren't just residential buildings. They were centers of commerce, social interaction, and cultural exchange.
Oh, right. Okay, so I'm picturing like a bustling marketplace with shopkeepers showcasing their wares beneath those covered walkways.
Precisely.
Must have been so vibrant, a real melting pot of activity and cultural influences. But I'm curious about how that marketplace functioned. Did the spatial organization of Qílóus, influence social interactions in any way? Were certain areas designated for specific types of businesses or social classes?
That's an insightful question. The source doesn't explicitly detail how the Qílóus dictated those social dynamics, but we can kind of speculate based on their design and historical context. It's likely that the more elaborate and centrally located Qílóus, they probably housed businesses catering to, a wealthier clientele, while the simpler structures, perhaps on the periphery, might have been occupied by tradespeople or those providing more everyday services.
Okay, so the layout of the marketplace itself becomes a reflection of the social hierarchy.
Exactly.
You're not just buying goods, you're navigating a complex web of social cues and economic realities. But let's not forget about those Western influenced styles that we were talking about earlier. I'm picturing a Qílóu with those grand Romanesque arches. What would those arches have signified to the people who lived and worked around them?
Well, remember those Romanesque arches, along with other Western architectural elements, were often introduced by those overseas Chinese, the ones who had been exposed to these styles abroad. Incorporating them into their Qílous would have been a way of showcasing, their worldliness and their access to new ideas and trends.
Oh, so it's not just about aesthetics, it's about sending a message.
Yeah.
About your social standing, your experiences, your connection to the wider world.
Precisely.
And that message wouldn't have been lost on the local community.
Oh, definitely not. Those Western-inspired Qílous would have stood out as symbols of modernity and sophistication. They might have even influenced architectural tastes and aspirations for years to come.
That makes me wonder, though, if there was any pushback against these Western influences. Were there people who viewed these architectural innovations as, a threat to traditional Chinese values?
That's an interesting point, and the source does hint at this tension. You know how we talked about how Qílou buildings were sometimes seen as those symbols of Western influence during the mid-20th century? Well, that suggests that their acceptance wasn't always universal, especially during times of political and social upheaval. Some may have viewed those Western architectural elements as a sign of cultural imperialism or a rejection of traditional Chinese design principles.
So Qílou becomes this battleground for competing cultural values.
In a way, yes.
Reflecting that complex relationship between tradition and modernity that China has grappled with for centuries, right?
Exactly.
It's fascinating how architecture can become a lens through which we can view these, larger historical and social forces.
Absolutely. And that lens becomes even more revealing when we consider the impact of the Xining, also known as the Ningyang Railway.
Okay, the Xining Railway. Now, I'm ready to explore how this railway ties into the story of Qílou.
It's a fascinating connection.
Was it specifically built to connect these towns, or was its impact more of an unintended consequence?
The Xining Railway, it was built and operated by overseas Chinese, and it wasn't explicitly designed to connect Qílou towns. However, it had a profound impact on their development. You see, it created an economic corridor that really facilitated trade, and it stimulated the growth of new towns all along its route.
So the railway wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a catalyst for economic and social change. The source mentions specific examples like Gongyi and Dushan. How did those towns benefit from the railway's arrival?
Well, imagine the transformation. Previously isolated communities suddenly had access to a wider market for their goods and services. The influx of people, the capital, it led to a surge in construction, including, you guessed it, more Qílou buildings.
More Qílous. I wonder if the styles of Qílou changed at all after the railway's arrival. Did the increased exposure to the outside world, did that lead to new architectural influences or, shift in design preferences?
That's a fascinating line of inquiry. While the source doesn't give us specific details about stylistic shifts, it's certainly plausible that the railway's impact, it extended to those architectural trends. Imagine, the exposure to new ideas, new building materials, even new clientele with different tastes and expectations.
It's like the railway might have sped up that blending of architectural styles that we've been talking about, right?
Exactly.
Creating a more diverse and eclectic streetscape.
Think of it as a visual representation of the rapid changes that were sweeping through Chinese society at the time. And that brings us to a crucial question for you to consider. How did this rapid development, how did it impact the social and cultural fabric of these Qílou towns? Did the influx of wealth and new ideas lead to greater prosperity for all, or did it create winners and losers?
That's a thought-provoking question to consider. It makes me realize that the story of Qílou, it's not just about bricks and mortar. It's about the people whose lives were, shaped by these buildings and the forces that brought them into being.
It's a complex picture, for sure. While the railway undoubtedly brought economic opportunities, it also introduced new challenges, potentially exacerbated existing social inequalities.
That makes sense. Not everyone would have benefited equally from this rapid development. It's like any major societal shift. There are those who adapt and thrive, and those who struggle to keep up. And I'm imagining how this tension might have played out in the architecture itself. Did the wealthy elite start incorporating even more elaborate Western features into their Qílous?
Yeah.
Further distinguishing themselves from those who couldn't afford such extravagance?
It's certainly a possibility. While the source doesn't explicitly state that, it's plausible that the railway's impact on the local economy would have been reflected in the architectural landscape. The influx of wealth and exposure to new ideas might have fueled a desire for even grander and more ostentatious displays of status, particularly among those who profited most from the railway's arrival.
So those multi-unit Qílous with their Baroque details and Romanesque arches become even more prominent. almost like a visual reminder of the growing economic divide within these towns.
Exactly.
It's a stark contrast to the simpler, more utilitarian Qílous that likely housed those whose livelihoods were disrupted by the changes brought about by the railway.
Exactly. And that contrast highlights a crucial point. Architecture isn't just about aesthetics or functionality. It's a reflection of the social and economic forces that are shaping a community.
Right. It makes you realize that every architectural choice, from the materials used to the decorative elements, can tell a story about the people who built and inhabited those spaces. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Qílóu culture as a whole. The source mentions that Qílóu architecture is integral to the visual and cultural identity of these towns. Can you elaborate on that connection?
Well, you see, Qílous are more than just buildings. They represent the spirit of these communities. Their hybrid identity, blending Eastern and Western influences, is embodied in the very design of these structures. The covered walkways, the mix of architectural styles, the integration of commercial and residential spaces. All of these speak to the unique character of Qílóu.
It sounds like Qílous were more than just places to live and work. They were the stage upon which Qílóu culture played out. I'm imagining those bustling market days, the lively conversations taking place beneath the covered walkways, and the sense of community that must have thrived within these spaces.
You're painting a vivid picture, and it's one that resonates with the essence of Qílóu. These towns were vibrant hubs of activity, driven by entrepreneurship, social interaction, and a constant flow of people and ideas. The Qílous provided the physical framework for all of that, shaping the rhythm of daily life and fostering a unique cultural identity.
That makes me think about the different cultural aspects mentioned in the source. Material, institutional, and spiritual. How did Qílóu architecture reflect those different facets of Qílóu culture?
Let's start with material culture. Qílous showcase a fascinating blend of architectural elements borrowed from various parts of the world. You have the Chinese rooflines, the European arches, the Southeast Asian influences, all coming together to create a unique visual tapestry that reflects the globalized nature of these communities.
It's like they took pieces of the world they encountered and wove them into the very fabric of their hometowns.
Exactly. And then you have the institutional culture, shaped by the experiences and practices that overseas Chinese brought back with them. The source mentions modern management systems and financial practices. These innovations were often introduced within those Qílou spaces, transforming the way business was conducted and influencing the economic development of these towns.
So it's not just about the outward appearance of the buildings. It's about how they facilitated a new way of thinking, a new way of organizing society and commerce. But what about the spiritual culture? How did that manifest itself within Qílóu architecture?
Well, Qílóu communities were characterized by a mix of traditional Chinese religions and beliefs brought back from abroad. This religious diversity is reflected in the various places of worship that were often integrated into the fabric of Qílóu neighborhoods. You might find a Buddhist temple next to a Christian church, both contributing to the spiritual landscape of these towns.
It paints a picture of a community that was open to new ideas and beliefs, willing to embrace the diversity that came with their global connections. It's a far cry from the image of a closed-off, insular society that some might associate with traditional China.
Precisely. Qílóu communities challenge those assumptions, demonstrating the dynamic and cosmopolitan nature of Chinese society, particularly in regions with a strong history of overseas migration.
It's amazing how Qílóu architecture becomes a symbol of that openness, a testament to the enduring power of cultural exchange. But I'm curious about something. We've talked a lot about the positive impacts of Qílóu architecture, but were there any downsides or unintended consequences?
That's a great question. And it's important to consider the full picture. While Qílous undoubtedly contributed to the vibrancy and economic prosperity of Qílóu towns, their design also presented some challenges. Remember how those covered walkways were meant to provide shelter from the elements? Well, they could also trap heat and humidity, making the spaces beneath them uncomfortable, especially during the summer months.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I can imagine how those narrow streets, even with the shade provided by the walkways, could become stifling the heat. And were there any other issues related to ventilation or sanitation?
Yes. Those were ongoing concerns. The source mentions that building codes were eventually put in place to address these issues, requiring features like larger windows, air shafts, and improved drainage systems. But it took time for these regulations to be implemented and enforced, so early Qílous likely faced significant challenges in maintaining comfortable and hygienic living and working conditions.
That's a reminder that even the most innovative architectural designs can have their shortcomings. especially when they're adapting to new environments and ways of life. It's like a constant process of trial and error, learning from experience, and making adjustments along the way.
Exactly. And those adjustments were often driven by the needs and feedback of the people who lived and worked in these spaces. So it wasn't just a top-down process, it was a collaborative effort between architects, builders, residents, and the governing bodies responsible for setting building codes.
It's a fascinating example of how architecture can be a reflection of not just cultural values, but also practical considerations and the evolution of building practices over time. But I'm curious about something. We talked about the regulations governing Qílóu design, but who was responsible for enforcing those regulations? Was it a centralized authority, or was it more of a community-driven effort?
That's an insightful question. And it gets to the heart of how these Qílóu towns govern themselves. The source doesn't explicitly detail the enforcement mechanisms, but we can speculate based on the historical context. It's likely that a combination of factors were at play. You would have had local officials responsible for overseeing building codes, but you also would have had a strong sense of community involvement and self-regulation.
So it wasn't just about following the letter of the law, it was about maintaining the standards and reputation of the community. I can imagine how the success of these towns, their ability to attract businesses and residents, would have depended on maintaining a certain level of quality and order within those Qílóu spaces.
Absolutely. And that sense of shared responsibility likely played a significant role in shaping the architectural landscape of Qílóu. It wasn't just about individual aspirations or aesthetic preferences. It was about creating a built environment that reflected the values and aspirations of the community as a whole.
That makes me think about the role of those returning overseas Chinese. We've talked about how they introduced new architectural ideas, but did they also play a role in shaping those building codes and regulations?
It's certainly plausible. Those individuals would have brought back not just architectural styles, but also ideas about urban planning, sanitation, and public health. They might have advocated for the adoption of building codes that reflected the best practices they observed in other parts of the world.
So they weren't just building houses, they were building a new vision of what a modern Chinese town could be. It's an incredible example of how individual actions can have a ripple effect, transforming not just the physical landscape, but also the social and cultural norms of a community.
Precisely. And those ripples continue to spread even today as we grapple with the challenges of preserving these architectural gems and finding ways to make them relevant and engaging for contemporary audiences.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've explored the origins and evolution of Qílóu architecture, but we haven't really touched on its current state. The source mentions challenges and decline. What are the biggest threats facing Qílóu today?
Well, many Qílóu towns, like many rural communities around the world, are facing challenges related to economic decline, outmigration, and a lack of resources for preservation efforts. As younger generations move to urban centers in search of opportunities, those left behind often struggle to maintain these historic structures.
That's heartbreaking to hear, especially considering the rich history and cultural significance embedded in these buildings. It's like losing a part of our collective memory, a tangible link to a bygone era of globalization and cultural exchange.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to find ways to preserve these architectural treasures. The source mentions opportunities for development through tourism and the creative industries. How do you see those playing out?
Tourism seems like an obvious avenue. These towns offer a unique blend of history, architecture, and cultural experiences. Imagine strolling through those covered walkways, soaking in the atmosphere, and learning about the fascinating stories embedded in these communities. But I also wonder about the potential downsides of tourism. Could it lead to overdevelopment, commercialization, and a loss of authenticity?
Those are valid concerns, and they highlight the delicate balance that must be struck between preserving cultural heritage and promoting economic development. It's essential to approach tourism in a way that respects the local community, minimizes negative impacts, and ensures that the benefits are shared equitably.
That makes me think about those communities that have successfully navigated the challenges of tourism. What lessons can we learn from them, and how can those lessons be applied to Qílóu towns to ensure that they benefit from tourism without losing their unique character?
That's a great question, and one that deserves further exploration. There are numerous examples around the world of communities that have embraced tourism while maintaining their cultural integrity. Key factors include community involvement in decision-making processes, responsible marketing strategies that prioritize authenticity over mass appeal, and investments in infrastructure and preservation efforts that benefit both residents and visitors.
It sounds like finding that balance is crucial. It's not about rejecting tourism outright, but about approaching it in a thoughtful and sustainable way that benefits both the local community and those who come to appreciate their unique cultural heritage.
Precisely. And that brings us to another opportunity mentioned in the source: film and media. How do you see those creative industries playing a role in the preservation and revitalization of Qílóu?
These towns, with their historic settings and compelling stories, are a treasure trove of inspiration for filmmakers, writers, and artists. Imagine a film set against the backdrop of those covered walkways, or a novel that brings to life the lives of those who built and inhabited these spaces. It's a chance to showcase the beauty and cultural richness of Qílóu to a wider audience, sparking curiosity and perhaps even inspiring people to visit and experience these places for themselves.
It's about using storytelling as a tool for preservation, raising awareness, and fostering a deeper appreciation for the cultural value of these communities. And it's not just about attracting tourists, it's about engaging younger generations, those who might have moved away or who might not have considered the historical significance of these places.
It's like breathing new life into these towns, reconnecting them to their past, while also creating a future where their heritage is valued and celebrated.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the central theme of our deep dive: the enduring power of cultural exchange. Qílóu architecture, with its blend of Chinese and Western influences, is a testament to that power, a reminder that our world is richer and more vibrant when we embrace diversity and learn from each other's experiences.
It's a powerful message, and one that resonates deeply in our increasingly interconnected world. As we move forward, it's essential to remember those lessons from the past, to appreciate the architectural and cultural legacies that have shaped our communities, and to find ways to ensure that they continue to inspire and enrich future generations.
It's like a call to action, isn't it? A reminder that we have a responsibility to protect and celebrate those cultural treasures that make our world so unique. Speaking of unique, we've discussed the Five Counties region extensively, but the source material keeps highlighting Taishan as something, well, special. It even calls it the biggest Qílóu village in Guangdong. What sets it apart from the other counties?
You're right, the source definitely seems to single out Taishan. It's not just about having the highest number of Qílóu buildings, is it? Because that alone wouldn't necessarily make it the most interesting.
Exactly. Taishan stands out for its incredible stylistic diversity. You'll find a wider range of architectural influences there, from those grand Romanesque arches we talked about earlier to the elaborate details of Baroque ornamentation. It's like walking through a living museum of architectural history, all contained within those charming covered walkways.
Now I'm picturing a visitor strolling down a street in Taishan, and each Qílóu they pass showcases a different chapter in this global story of cultural exchange. It must be an incredible experience.
It really is. And remember our conversation about the overseas Chinese? Taishan had a particularly high concentration of immigrants who ventured to all corners of the world. It's no wonder their Qílous reflect such a diverse array of influences.
So those global connections we've been discussing, they really become amplified in Taishan. It's not just a passive blending of styles. It's an active expression of the town's cosmopolitan history and its people's willingness to embrace new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, does the source mention any specific examples of how, life played out within those Qílous in Taishan?
Yes. The source mentions bustling markets with vendors from all walks of life, vibrant shops selling goods from, around the world, even financial institutions that really helped fuel the town's economic growth. All of this activity, it took place beneath those sheltering walkways, creating this dynamic and interconnected community.
It makes me think about how those covered walkways weren't just a design feature. They were the backbone of social and economic life in these towns. They provided a space where people from diverse backgrounds could come together, exchange ideas, and build a shared prosperity.
That's beautifully put. And remember those different facets of Qílóu culture we discussed earlier: material, institutional, and spiritual. They all converged within those Qílóu spaces, creating a microcosm of this unique cultural blend.
It's fascinating how Qílóu architecture becomes a lens through which we can view the evolution of Qílóu culture. It's not just about the buildings themselves. It's about the stories they tell, the lives they housed, and the values they embody. Speaking of values, we discussed how those returning overseas Chinese brought back modern ideas about management and finance. But did those ideas also influence the actual design and construction of Qílous?
Absolutely. The attention to ventilation, sanitation, even those wind-resistant features, it speaks to a forward-thinking approach to building design. It's clear that practicality and functionality were highly valued alongside, aesthetics. Remember those round openings in the upper
Oh,
walls?
yeah?
Those weren't just decorative. They were likely designed to improve airflow and reduce wind pressure during storms.
So it's like they were blending traditional Chinese design principles with modern innovations from the West, creating a style that was both beautiful and functional, rooted in the past but also looking towards the future.
Exactly. And that blend of tradition and modernity is what makes Qílóu architecture so fascinating. It reflects this pivotal moment in Chinese history when the country was grappling with its place in a rapidly changing world.
And that struggle, that tension between holding on to tradition and embracing new ideas, that's something that resonates, even today, isn't it? We still face similar challenges in our own lives, trying to find that balance between honoring our heritage and adapting to the demands of a globalized world.
You've hit upon a universal truth, and that's what makes exploring topics like Qílóu architecture so rewarding. It's not just about learning historical facts, it's about connecting with those deeper themes that continue to shape our lives and our understanding of the world around us.
It's like a journey of discovery, not just about a specific architectural style, but about ourselves and the complex tapestry of influences that have shaped who we are.
Beautifully said. And now, as we reach the end of our deep dive, I have one final thought-provoking question for you to ponder. We've explored the rich history and cultural significance of Qílóu architecture, but what do you think the future holds for these remarkable buildings and the communities they represent?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. We've discussed the challenges and opportunities facing Kaohsiung towns, from the threats of, economic decline and outmigration to the potential of tourism and the creative industries. Ultimately, the future of Qílóu architecture, it rests in our hands. Will we allow these architectural treasures to fade into obscurity, or will we find ways to preserve them, celebrate them, and ensure that they continue to inspire future generations?
Perhaps it's by seeking out images of these stunning buildings online, or maybe even planning a visit to experience their unique charm firsthand. Whatever path you choose, let the story of Qílóu architecture inspire you to appreciate the enduring power of cultural exchange and the beauty of a world where, diverse influences come together to create something truly special.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Qílóu architecture. Until next time, keep exploring.